Well, greetings and welcome to our Bible study. We are in Isaiah lesson 15 today. And you may notice here that things are a little bit different. I have a map splashed up on the screen. I'm trying a few things here to see if maybe we can add to our Bible study. I'm not going to promise this is going to happen all the time, but I wanted to, especially today, look at a few maps because we're really going to look at the history of empires here before we move into Isaiah 40. Matter of fact, I don't think I'll be reading any of Isaiah 40 today. We're going to get into Isaiah 40 by way of the book of Daniel today. And I may make this a little bit shorter of a lesson today to help me get used to this new technology, and we'll just see how it goes. Let me know what you think here. But I have on screen here before us the divided kingdom. When we began the study here, I talked a little bit about the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. If you recall, we talked a little bit about how Israel had a civil war and the country was split in two from the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Jerusalem, where the temple is, was a part of the southern kingdom, and that obviously was the house of David there. And the other houses divided up north. And we read through the prophets here, just the trouble that they went through with the Assyrian Empire, Babylonians, and the Persians, and then later the Greek Empire comes in. Then past that, we haven't talked about, I don't think, the Roman Empire. But I'm going to leave this up on the screen, and as we go now into the entrance, the stepping into Isaiah 40. Just to remind you, we've covered chapters 1 through 35, and that was the judgment chapters. And we've covered the historical interlude. That's what we finished up with in lesson 14, chapters 36 through 39. And we're beginning this process of moving to our final portion of Isaiah, chapters 40 through 66. It's if you recall, I called it a poetic form, and the theme here is grace. And so as we left our historical interlude, we saw that that was a foreshadowing of the Babylons, the role that the Babylons would play in the ongoing story of Isaiah, the prophet, from if you remember, 701 BC to 686 BC was his time period. The Babylonians will not attack Jerusalem until 605 BC, but Isaiah does talk about them. We have in the historical interlude this foreshadowing that Hezekiah has shown the Babylonian envoys everything. And Isaiah can rightly say, and you really don't need to be a prophet to figure this out, that Babylon is going to rise, and you have, King, you have just given Babylon all the information they need to defeat you. This is what Isaiah proclaims to Hezekiah. The shadow has been cast at the end of chapter 39 here. And we know from reading 1st and 2nd Kings, and we know exactly what happens. The Assyrian Empire, on the death of Sennacherib, begins its decline, and the Babylonian Empire begins its rise. And in 605 BC, Babylon will attack Jerusalem, led by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon at the time. And the Jews will wave the white flag and give up. Captives will be taken back to Babylon from the royal family. Why? We might ask, why should captives be taken? Well, there's two reasons for them to be taken here. Let me get the Babylonian Empire map here and see if I can... All right, so I don't really have it colored out here on the map, but we get some ideas of them, some of the treks that they take, and they're wanting to come through Judah, Jerusalem, and get to Egypt to control the bread belt of the bread basket. I mean, of the entire world. Egypt is really the main supplier of food for the known world of this time. And so Babylon comes in and takes captives with them, and there are two reasons for an empire to take the kingdom here. The first reason is that they become a vassal of the Babylonians, and what I mean, they're beholden to them, and so to take captives to Babylon, it ensures a tribute that taxes are being paid. So to make sure these payments come about, the king says, "I'm going to take some of your family, some of the folks that you treasure, to make sure you send in your payments." And the second reason that empires usually come in and take captives is that they're expecting an ongoing relationship with the country that they've conquered, and so there's this ongoing relationship expected from between Babylon and Judah, and so there's going to be correspondence that will need to go back and forth between these two countries, whether it's written or in oral meetings as well. Well, the Babylonians speak the Babylonian language, and the people of Judah and Jerusalem, they speak Hebrew or Aramaic. And how are they going to communicate? Well, some of the young men from the royal family are taken captive back to Babylon, and they'll be trained in the language and the literature of Babylon. And that is the oral or the oral and written language of Babylon. And they will then serve in the court of Nebuchadnezzar as translators. And we find that's exactly what happens if you turn with me into the book of Daniel. And so if you have your Bible with you and your Isaiah, flip over Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and you'll run into Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. This is what Daniel says. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of the Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hands, with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his gods. And he brought the articles into the treasure house of his gods. And that's Daniel 1 and 2 there. So in 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar attacked for the first time. And then verse 3, he says, Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring some of the children of Israel, and some of the king's descendants, and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge, and quick to understand, who had the ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans, or the Babylonians. And it's exactly what Isaiah told Hezekiah would happen 100 years before. That some of your descendants will be taken captive and to the palace of the king of Babylon. And here we are in Daniel, and sure enough, it's happened. They were young men without physical defect, we're told in scriptures, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. They're bright, young Jewish men, and when we say young men, think maybe 12 or 13 years old. And he was, the Babylonian eunuch was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. Verse 5, the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter into the king's service. So they are native-speaking Hebrews who will learn the Babylonian language in an intensive 3-year course, and then after that they would serve the king. And so that was the idea there, that of this captivity, that there was some kind of training that went on to allow them to become translators for the Babylonian kingdom and to serve the king. So as we read this, verse 6 continues in Daniel chapter 1. Now from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. To them the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name of Belshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. And we know that little Vacation Bible song, don't we? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So we find in the book of Daniel, which again is set in 605 BC to 539 BC, that what Isaiah said indeed comes to pass. And Daniel is one of those from the royal family that is taken captive to Babylon. Again, that's a foreshadowing, and it takes place in chapter 39 of Isaiah, which we just left this past lesson. And so at the end of this historical interlude, the interlude explains why we have the judgment up at the front part of Isaiah. And at the end of the book, in the back, why we're going to have the events that we're about to talk about here in 40 on to 66. Babylon will indeed ascend into power. They defeat Assyria. Let's see if I can pull up Assyria's map here to show you. So there's Assyria. And you remember we talked about this. I can't get my mouse to work here. But if you look down south where Israel is, there's like a little heart-shaped area by the Red Sea. Assyria wanted to get to Egypt as well to control the food source. They had to go through Judah and Jerusalem. They got to the northern kingdom, and that was defeated. But they were unable to take care of Jerusalem, and so they never got to go back there. And so we have the Assyrian kingdom defeated, and after they came after Judah and Jerusalem, they'll go back. Babylon defeats Assyria, then defeats Judah, and then attacks the city, and the people go into captivity. Nebuchadnezzar attacks Jerusalem in 605 BC. Then he attacks them again. And let me get Babylon back here. And he attacks Judah, if you see that at the bottom here. Let me move it up just a tad. And attacks Jerusalem again in 597 BC. And in 597 BC, he takes more captives back to Babylon. And Ezekiel is one of those prophets that he takes. As a matter of fact, Ezekiel will write his entire book in captivity in Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar then attacks again in 588, laying siege to Jerusalem for 2 years. And Jerusalem will fall to the Babylonians on August 14th, 586 BC. And how do we know that? We know that from reading Kings and Chronicles. But here in Isaiah 39, it was foreshadowed. Isaiah said this is going to happen. He prophesies that, and then historically written, it happened. We see that the historians wrote it in wrote it in Kings and Chronicles that it did happen. After the captivity, Babylon begins to decline, and the Persian Empire to the east begins to come up. And so this is the Persian Empire. So they're a little farther to the east. Again, I wish I'll figure out how to get my mouse working here. But you see Egypt over to your left. And if you follow that up, Israel is just a little ways right of that. The Persian Empire is farther east, obviously, but they come all the way down to take over Egypt. And so, what do the Persians do? Do they take more captives? No. It's a very different set of circumstances here. The Assyrians, when they conquered nations, they took captives. That was the way empires did. They took captives. Persia did something very different. They did not take captives. And this was Cyrus. Cyrus was the king of Persia. And I guess historians kind of that time call him the enlightened king. Cyrus would allow all the captive people from the Assyrian Empire, from the Babylonian Empire that took over from the Assyrians, to go back home. Not only did he let the Jews go back home, but everybody that was taken by Assyria and Babylon, they were able to return home, rebuild their cities, rebuild their temples. If you remember us talking about Nehemiah, that's in that Persian Empire time. Nehemiah goes back. Ezekiel's already gone back to establish the temple, life in the temple, and now Nehemiah goes back to restore the city, the walls of the city, and there's some we talked about that in a previous study, and I look more at the spiritual connotations of that. But Nehemiah restored the cities, rebuilt, the temple had been rebuilt. He restored the infrastructure. This is what the king of Persia allowed to happen. Again, not only for the Jewish people, but for all the people that had been conquered as well. And the Persian Empire will finance it, and then taxes will then be paid to Persia after that. And so, in a sense, it's a gigantic economic stimulus program, and it works because Cyrus the Great builds the Persian Empire using this strategy in a matter of, amazingly, 20 years. Things are rebuilt, and Cyrus becomes quite a rich man because he had rebuilt the infrastructure of most of the world of that time. And there was an economic boom because of that, and that's why you'll see, even though Cyrus is a pagan king, that the Jewish people celebrate the work that Cyrus did, because he allowed them to rebuild the temple, allowed them to reorganize their religious system, and built up Jerusalem, and sort of restored this nation. And so he's celebrated for that, and you'll hear national leaders, sometimes Jewish nations will call a country that helps them out, like King Cyrus. Matter of fact, I think Trump, our current president, received an award calling him like King Cyrus because of some of the aid that he's given Jerusalem in recognizing their sovereignty and so forth. And anyway, so that's what we find out with the Persian Empire as they come in. And you can read more about that, the Persian Empire and their influence, again, in Ezra, Ezra and Nehemiah. And I said Ezekiel early, so ignore that. I meant Ezra going back. But you can learn more about the Persian influence on Judaism, I suppose, in Ezra and Nehemiah. And I'm sure we'll talk about Ezra and Nehemiah more, and we'll talk about the Persian Empire more as we continue to study the prophets too. So now is when I want to stop our historical lesson, so to speak. I hope it's not too bad for you today. And we're going to move into chapter 40, our third and our final segment of Isaiah from the literary perspective. And we move ahead to the Babylonian captivity and what will happen after that captivity. So we're, in a sense, flashing forward into a future as we read 40 through 66. And I'm going to stop there, and next week we will get into chapter 40 as we spend time together. Well, you have a great week. Hope to see you Friday with our devotion, and then Sunday as we worship together, either on our property or through the internet. Blessings. Take care. Bye now.